you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, or purchase something from a Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. After the fight on July 20th at Peachtree Creek and at Bald Hill on July 21st, William T. Sherman's Army Group was closing in on the city of Atlanta, and Confederate Army Commander John Bell Hood had just lost more casualties in his attempt to throw back Union forces. Now, Hood would launch one of his boldest tactical maneuvers of the entire war. When the Union captured Bald Hill, they could now enfilade the Confederate outer defensive line. That position became untenable. In the afternoon on July 21st, Hood called together his corps commanders and discussed plans for an attack that, if it worked, might spell disaster for Sherman's armies. He chose his most experienced corps commander, William Hardee, to take his entire corps and march around the left flank of Sherman's army group. Those Union troops were from the Army of the Tennessee under James B. McPherson. Once around the flank, Hardee would push toward Decatur a few miles away. From there, the Confederate corps commander could attack the rear of Sherman's army and send them into confusion. The group broke up and Hardee began pulling his troops out of their entrenchments and moved them through the city. This caused pandemonium in Atlanta. Citizens saw Confederate soldiers leaving the city and heading south and assumed that Hood had decided to give up the city to Sherman. They began to throw their belongings in wagons, onto their horses, or over their shoulders and started to leave the city. The rebel soldiers also didn't know where they were headed and assumed they were evacuating, so many took that opportunity to take items as they left the city, like food and little trinkets that easily could be carried with them. Benjamin Cheatham's corps and Alexander P. Stewart's corps used the darkness to pull their troops from the outer defensive line and occupy the city defensive line. Hardee, a few hours into his movement, could see that his troops were too worn out from 2 days of fighting to accomplish the march through the night that Hood had wanted. He told Hood about this, and Hood called another conference. This time, only Hardee, Cheatham, and Cavalry Commander Joseph Wheeler attended. The original plan would be altered, even though Hood declared later that there was no altering of the original plan. Now, with this new plan, Hardee would simply march his corps to the flank and rear of McPherson's line and launch an attack to roll up Sherman's line. Wheeler would guard Hardee's flank and push on to Decatur. When Hardee had engaged McPherson and began to push the Union flank, Cheatham's corps would emerge from the city's defenses and continue the push, aiding Hardee's corps. Sherman and the other commanders in his army group quickly realized something was going on. Confederate troops were gone from their front, and many believed that Hood was evacuating the city. Some commanders even rode out to the outer defenses and found them empty. Pushing on, they quickly ran into Confederate skirmishers, but the Union general simply believed this was a rear guard protecting the retreating rebels. Sherman began preparing for a movement west and south of Atlanta, anticipating Hood's army would head in that direction, but nothing much could be done until daylight on July 22nd. Hood hoped that Hardee could launch a dawn attack, but the mileage was too great for Hardee to move his entire corps and prepare them to launch such a bold move at such an hour. Morning dawned on July 22, 1864, and Hardee continued to place his corps on the flank of McPherson's army. William B. Bates' division was on the right, then William H. T. Walker's division to their left, followed by Patrick Cleburne's division, with George Maney's division behind Cleburne. In concert with the infantry attack, Joseph Wheeler's cavalry headed northeast of Hardee's position to attack Decatur. Sherman met with McPherson in the late morning, and Sherman wanted McPherson to send Thomas Sweeney's division to Decatur to destroy more of the railroad, but McPherson was afraid of his left flank being attacked and convinced him to allow Sweeney to move to the left, and if no attack came by 1 p.m., then he would send him to Decatur. Sweeney moved to the left flank, and McPherson and Sherman sat down under a tree near Sherman's headquarters, where Sherman laid out a map to explain where George Thomas's Army of the Cumberland was located now since the Confederates had evacuated the outer defenses. Light musketry of skirmishing could be heard near the left flank, and some sounds coming from the direction of Decatur. Both generals pulled out their compasses and checked the direction of the musketry. Then McPherson rode off to shore up his flank. The musketry came from Hardee's skirmishers, preempting the flank attack. The bold Confederate attack ran into problems as it stepped off. Bates' division on the far right was misinformed about a mill pond in their front, which forced two of his brigades to sidle to the right to avoid the pond, leaving the brigade of Kentuckians known as the Orphan Brigade to approach the Union flank by itself. On Bates' left, Walker made a weird decision. He noticed an entangled briar patch in front of one of his regiments, and instead of simply making accommodations for the regiment to move around it, He went to his corps commander, Hardee, to ask permission to do it. Hardee lashed out, saying, "No, sir, this movement has been delayed too long already. Go and obey my orders." Walker rode off and commented to a member of his staff, "I shall make him remember this insult. If I survive this battle, he shall answer me for it." Hardee did send Walker an apology, but Walker was fully insulted and wouldn't accept the apology. Walker went out to investigate the ground in front of his troops, who were attempting to maneuver around the same mill pond that threw Bates' men into confusion. As Walker rode out in front of his troops, Union skirmishers unleashed a volley, and one of the bullets hit Walker, killing him instantly. However, there is a dispute as to when Walker was killed. 16th Corps Commander Grenville Dodge, the man who commanded troops that would be attacked by Walker's men, claimed that he witnessed Walker get shot off his horse during the battle near one of his brigades commanded by States Rights Gist, but Dodge had never met Walker to anyone's knowledge, and to spot that one man being killed amidst the smoke and chaos of a battle seems a little far-fetched. Hugh Mercer, an inexperienced officer as far as combat goes, took command of the division in the wake of Walker's death. It was after 12 noon when Hardee's corps made their attack. The first troops to make contact with the enemy was those under Bate, but even though Bate had 3 brigades in his division, the mill pond threw 2 of his brigades into so much confusion that only one brigade, the Orphan Brigade of Kentuckians, attacked. The men from the Bluegrass State rushed against the Federals under Dodge, and the two sides threw lead at one another, with the rebels putting up a good fight, but their battle line was smaller than their Union counterpart, and Dodge moved the 7th Iowa to reinforce the 66th Indiana. Union artillery blew holes in the rebel line, and without support, Bates' lone brigade fell back, utterly defeated. Walker's division, now under Hugh Mercer, made their presence on the field. George A. Smith led his brigade to confront the Federals, who had just thrown back the Orphan Brigade. Smith was new to brigade command, having taken over the brigade 2 days before, after the death of Clement Stevens at Peachtree Creek. He attacked the Union force under brigade commanders August Mercy and John Morrill. Dodge grew concerned over the attacks being launched by Hardee's corps and decided to launch his own attack against the approaching rebels. He ordered the 12th Illinois and the 81st Ohio to attack Smith's brigade. It drove back the right flank, but Smith's left was holding on, still engaging in the heavy musketry of Morrill's men. Dodge then ordered the 27th Ohio and 39th Ohio to attack in their front, sending the rest of Smith's brigade running toward the rear. But there was more Confederates coming. States Rights Gist Brigade swung into line against the Union defenders, and a brutal struggle between the two sides developed as Gist's men tried in vain to dislodge Dodge's men from their position. Soon Mercer's old brigade, now commanded by William Barkaloo, came onto the scene, but by the time that brigade made it to within musketry range, Gist's men were starting to fall back, and it was decided that throwing another brigade into the fray wouldn't yield any successful result, and it pulled back. Amazingly, Dodge's command was able to hold on despite being attacked by 2 Confederate divisions. However, Bates' division only attacked with 1 brigade instead of all 3. More Confederate troops were making their way into the battle, with Patrick Cleburne and George Maney's division engaging with the Federals. Patrick Cleburne's division was aimed at the Union flank of Francis P. Blair's 17th Corps, with James A. Smith's brigade and Mark P. Lowry's brigade advancing into the open space between Blair's troops and those under Grenville Dodge. Captain Richard Beard of Canton, Mississippi, commanded Smith's skirmish line as they moved through the wide gap in the Union line. As the skirmishers moved through a wooded area and came out into the open, they saw a Union general officer, an orderly, and his staff nearby. Beard called for the mounted Federals to halt, but the general officer, in the words of Beard, raised his hat as if he were saluting a lady, wheeled his horse's head to the right, and dashed off to the rear in a full gallop. The rebel riflemen leveled their weapons and fired. Beard believed from the men who fired that it was Corporal Robert F. Coleman of Company B, 5th Confederate Regiment, that fired the deadly projectile that hit the officer. The bullet entered his back, and because he was bent over, it traveled up into the general, puncturing the lung and nearly exiting his chest. The orderly had turned his horse to ride away as well, but was knocked off his horse by a tree branch. He rushed to the general's side once he regained his composure and asked the general if he was hurt. The general groaned, "Orderly, I am." Immediately after he had spoken to me, he turned over on his face, straightened himself out, and convulsively clutched the leaves with his hands, his body in the meantime quivering and trembling like an aspen. The Confederate skirmishers grabbed the orderly by the belt and dragged him away, then asked who the general was. The orderly responded with tears streaming down his face, "Sir, it is General McPherson. You have killed the best man in our army." McPherson wasn't dead yet. He lingered unconscious as the rebel skirmishers moved past him, taking his hat and probably his belt and watch. A short time later, a Union soldier from Iowa stumbled across the body, claiming he was still alive at that point, but unconscious. He attempted to stop another soldier from absconding with McPherson's pocketbook filled with $1,000, but was unsuccessful. The thief threw the pocketbook on the ground, leaving with the cash. A short time later, some of the staff that had got away when McPherson was shot came back with an ambulance wagon to retrieve the body. They loaded it into the vehicle and sped off to get out of danger. At Sherman's headquarters, Sherman knew about the death of McPherson long before the body made it there. He took only a few moments to reflect on his subordinate, then returned to his work, stating that the Army deserved his whole attention that day. He then sent an aide to inform General John A. Logan that he would take command of the Army of the Tennessee, while he saw about the protection of Decatur. Some of Dodge's troops happened to capture some rebels that belonged to Smith's rebel brigade, and were able to recover nearly all of the stolen items belonging to McPherson, including his belt and field glasses. Only his watch and hat were not recovered on the field. The famed division of Claiborne made their way through the undulating terrain, forests, and streams to engage with the Federal soldiers. The terrain split up Claiborne's men, but his brigades would do some of the most damage to the Federals that day, nonetheless. Govan's men stepped off toward William Hall's brigade, but the left side of Govan's brigade got stopped in their tracks by a heavy abattis in front of the Union position that made it difficult to attack. Despite not getting close in on the Federals, Govan's men kept up a steady musketry. An officer in the 16th Iowa recalled the scene. Officers and men worked enthusiastically. Guns became so heated that they could not be handled, the powder flashing from them as the cartridge was dropped in. The officers prepared the cartridges for the men and helped them load their guns. More splendid firing, or more effectual in its results, was never witnessed in the Army. The two sides were less than 30 yards apart, when through the smoke some Union soldiers saw white fabric waving. Some of the Arkansans were surrendering, and they began to take the men in and collect their weapons. About that time, the right wing of Govan's brigade wheeled to the left, catching Hall's men from the rear, capturing 6 artillery pieces in the process. Those cannons were on their way to the Union left flank to assist Grenville Dodge and his corps. The 53rd Illinois and the 3rd Iowa shifted into position to help block Govan's right wing, but it only blunted the attack. Once Govan's men found the flank of the newly arrived Federal regiments, they quickly turned it and kept driving the Federals back. The 11th Iowa evacuated their position and headed north, leaving the 16th Iowa alone. By this point, there was no hope for the 16th to get out from the Confederate pincer. In an odd moment, Lieutenant Colonel Addison Sanders, commander of the 16th, looked all around him and saw there was no hope for escape. Part of his regiment was already crossing the entrenchments and surrendering, so he agreed with his comrades that surrendering would be the best course of action. He held in his hand the sword of a Confederate officer. He returned it to the same rebel that he had captured, and then handed his own sword to the rebel. He did have one request, though. 15 citizens from Davenport, Iowa presented that sword to him, and he would like it back when the war was over. The rebel assured him that he would do his best, but after the war, Sanders never received the sword. Despite the victory, Govan's brigade was badly shot up and had around 400 prisoners to take care of, plus its 2 wings were disjointed. It would take hours to reconfigure their lines and form for another attack. Right behind Govan was Maney's division of Tennesseans. Maney had taken over the division temporarily when Benjamin Cheatham took temporary command of John Bell Hood's corps. There were 4 brigades in that division, but Hardee had sent one to the right to help William H.T. Walker and William Bate, leaving Maney with 3 brigades to follow up on Claiborne's success. The Tennesseans advanced and pushed away the weak line formed by the Iowans of Hall's brigade, then came into contact with Benjamin Pott's brigade. William McLean of the 32nd Ohio recalled his killing of a rebel officer. "I drew a level bead on his belt as he waved his sword and cheered his men forward as I ever drew on a squirrel, and I know, too, that when my smoke blew away, his saddle was empty. Sometimes I wonder if it is right for a man to single out his mark that way, but I couldn't help it. That colonel was doing more against us than any man I could see, and I felt that it would help us the most to drop him." An artilleryman detailed to be on Otho Straw's staff remembered, "We were subjected to the most terrific fire I've ever seen. I never prayed on the battlefield before, but this time I prayed to the great God to spare me. I had no idea I could get out with my life and limb." To the east, Michael McGivney's brigade also stalled out in the face of the Union resistance. Out of Hardee's corps, the divisions of Bate, Mercer, who took over after Walker's death, and Maney were unsuccessful in attacking the Union line, leaving only Cleburne's division. James A. Smith's brigade was now deep into the enemy rear, and Mark P. Lowry's brigade was right behind. Smith's men were advancing to the east of Bald Hill. It appeared that Smith's brigade would crash into the backs of the Federal soldiers. However, William Harrow pulled John Oliver and Charles Walcutt's brigades out of their entrenchments and faced them to resist the approaching Confederates. Smith took some punishment from the Federal soldiers, then pulled back a short distance to see what would develop. He asked for help from Cleburne, but before reinforcements could come, Smith was wounded. Roger Mills took command of the brigade, but was soon wounded by an artillery shell. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Young of the 10th Texas took command of the brigade. The 15th Michigan and 99th Indiana attacked Young's men, capturing 17 officers and 165 men, along with some regimental flags. All but 2 men of Company A of the 18th Texas Cavalry dismounted, were killed, wounded, or captured that day. Young's brigade couldn't take the punishment from the infantry attack or the artillery bombardment peppering their ranks and fell back. They found a log cabin near where they stopped, which they tore apart to create a breastwork and settle in case of a counterattack. The brigade of Mark P. Lowry came up behind Smith's brigade, but the terrain handled the brigade roughly, with it splitting into 2, with some regiments getting lost. It also picked up some regiments from Smith's brigade and John Carter's brigade of Maney's division. The left wing smashed into Hall's line that Govan had sent to the rear earlier, with the 2 sides engaged in a bitter struggle. One Union officer described the scene. Regimental commanders with their colors, and such men as would follow them, would not infrequently occupy one side of the works and our men the other. The flags of 2 opposing regiments would meet on the opposite sides of the same works, and would be flaunted by their respective bearers in each other's faces. Men were bayoneted across the works, and officers with their swords fought hand to hand with men with bayonets. Colonel William Belknap's incident illustrates how close the 2 sides were while fighting. During the melee, Belknap grabbed the colonel of the 45th Alabama, Harris Lampley, by the coat and drug him over and behind the works. The rebel officer had been horribly wounded in the shoulder, with the bullet entering that location, then going down into his waist. He would later die at a Union hospital. Lieutenant John Safely of the 13th Iowa jumped across the works only to have a Confederate aim his musket directly at his heart. "Don't you shoot, you cuss," I yelled, "or I will order 20 bullets through your carcass in a moment." When the rebel raised up a bit to get a better shot, the lieutenant struck his gun to one side with one hand and grabbed him by the nape of the neck with the other and whirled him about 10 feet head over heels inside of our line. The right wing of Lowry's line met a larger force than the left wing. Manning Force of Leggett's division assembled his brigade when he saw the rebels coming, and as they clashed, another desperate fight occurred. During the hail of musketry, Timothy Walker, the son of Force's former law partner, was seriously wounded in the leg, just above the knee. Force went to help the captain by trying to stop the bleeding. As he was doing so, a rebel bullet entered his left cheek and exited below his right cheekbone. A nasty wound that looked worse than it turned out to be. It didn't affect his speech or eyesight, but it did leave him disfigured and in pain. The spread-out rebel brigade fell back. With no help from Maney and his own brigades being separated by the terrain, Cleburne's attack stalled out. To the north, Confederate Army Commander John Bell Hood ordered in Benjamin Cheatham's corps for the next phase of the battle. Those troops would attack near where the Union line crossed the Georgia Railroad. While William Hardee's corps attacked the Union left flank, Confederate Army of Tennessee Commander John Bell Hood was preparing another corps to throw themselves against the Union line held by the Union Army of the Tennessee, now commanded by John A. Logan. Hardee's attacks were stalling out as another Confederate corps approached the field of battle. Although Hardee's corps hadn't been as successful as hoped for, their major attack drew Union troops from the Army of the Tennessee's right to its left, leaving an 800-yard gap in the Union line north of the railroad. The next Confederate corps to enter the fight was commanded by Benjamin Cheatham. Cheatham was a Tennessean and had been given temporary command of Hood's old corps when that general took command of the whole army. Cheatham controlled the corps until the permanent commander of the unit, Stephen D. Lee, made it to the outskirts of Atlanta from Mississippi. It was 3:15 p.m. when Hood ordered Cheatham's men forward. John C. Brown commanded Thomas Heineman's old division after Heineman left the Army of Tennessee. Brown's division straddled the railroad, while Carter Stevenson's division occupied the right and Henry Clayton held the left flank. The three divisions moved out from their position in the defenses around Atlanta. However, for unknown reasons, Stevenson's division only went part of the way to the Federal line and didn't move further, leaving Clayton and Brown's divisions to launch their attacks without the full corps strength. Clayton during the advance moved behind Brown's division. Arthur Manigault commanded a brigade in Brown's division, and he remembered the Union as he advanced. There stood the enemy in their breastworks. Their flags were fluttering lazily in the breeze. I saw and noticed all this only for a moment, and thought it looked very pretty, but in the next instant the whole scene was shut out, everything enveloped in smoke. The two Confederate divisions closed in on the Union position, but as they advanced, a huge gap emerged in Brown's line, so he decided to plug it with Samuel Benton's brigade. The small brigade could do little against the enemy in their front. During the fight, Benton would be hit in the chest by an artillery shell fragment and be hit in the foot by a Union bullet. Doctors would amputate the foot, but Benton would die 6 days later from his wounds. In his absence, William Brantley took command of the brigade. The Union riflemen behind earthworks sent the Confederates running after about 10 minutes of fighting. By this point, John Coltart and Arthur Manigault were heavily engaged, but couldn't make any headway against the Federals. The 12th Indiana, facing the Confederates south of the railroad, had some Alabama Unionists fighting alongside them. Those Alabamians had joined its ranks when that unit was stationed in northern Alabama. The commander of the regiment allowed one of those Unionists to bring his slave along on the campaign. The slave stood beside the Alabamian and handed him cartridges to make the firing quicker. Brown called on Jacob Sharp's brigade of Mississippians to attack through Manigault's brigade and hit the Union line. The right flank of Sharp's brigade hit the Federals at the railroad cut, which bisected the Union line. The Mississippians began to swarm over the enemy's left flank, taking prisoners and causing havoc in the rear of the line. Within minutes, the entire Federal line broke and ran, although some did hold out until completely surrounded. A member of the 7th Mississippi wrote to his father that the Yanks were very obstinate in leaving their work. They remained in their ditches until we were in 6 feet of them. Some surrendered, some run, and some fought till they were killed. I was among them shooting. I have often heard of a hand-to-hand fight, but this time I witnessed it. It was the closest quarters I ever was in. Behind Brown's division was Clayton's division, which had taken up a position behind Brown once the advance began. A hole had been punched in the Union line, and Clayton sent Marcellus Stovall's brigade, now commanded by Abner Johnston, into the gap between Sharp and Coltart's men. The added pressure of the Confederate reinforcements and the hole already in the Union line led the Union regiments to Johnston's right to begin to collapse. Soon, Brown's division and part of Clayton's division occupied nearly a mile of enemy works. Each Union brigade that was pushed back attempted to launch their own counterattack, but they were pushed back each time from the musketry of the rebels. Bushrod Jones's brigade of Clayton's division was sent north to help secure the Confederate left. Jones himself went to each of his regimental commanders and told them that they were going to be taking up a position on Manigault's left, but to wait until all the regimental commanders were notified and he gave the order to move. Jones told the first 2 regiments the plan. Then, as he was telling it to the others, he saw the 36th and 38th Alabama moving to the left. Manigault, afraid that he would be attacked and scared his left flank was in the air, ordered those 2 regiments into position. Jones told the rest of his regiments their orders, then moved with them to the northeast. Meanwhile, John Higley, temporarily commanding Alpheus Baker's brigade, moved to the north as well to find the Confederate left flank and extend it or protect it from Union attacks, but the undulating terrain prevented them from fighting at their desired location. Randall Gibson's brigade of Louisianians from Clayton's division wouldn't be engaged, never being sent into the fight. Out of the 12 brigades that Cheatham sent into battle, less than half of them were either engaged or took up a position on the Union's abandoned works. As the rebels enjoyed their initial success, the dispossessed Union brigades and reinforcements prepared for a counterattack to take back their position. Confederate forces under temporary Corps Commander Benjamin Cheatham now occupied a mile of Union entrenchments, but William T. Sherman, the commander of the Union Army Group, wasn't sitting idle. Sherman quickly dispatched Charles Wood's division of Morgan L. Smith's 15th Corps to prepare to guard the flank and prepare for a counterstrike. Meanwhile, 20 pieces of artillery began to batter the Confederates in their newly captured works. John M. Schofield, commander of the Army of the Ohio, supplied many of those pieces that kept the Confederates in check that day, John A. Logan, the commander of the Army of the Tennessee, in the wake of James B. McPherson's death during the battle, rode south to Grenville Dodge's corps to see how the battle was developing when a staffer from Sherman rode up to him and told him about the breakthrough. Logan turned to Dodge and told him that he needed his best brigade to reinforce the 15th Corps as they were going to retake the works. Dodge dispatched August Mercy's brigade north to help the 15th Corps retake their lost works. The brigade proceeded toward the breakthrough, and as they crossed the railroad, a bullet killed Mercy's horse, and he himself went down with a serious leg wound. This left the brigade in the hands of Robert Adams. The Union brigade surged forward, charging west into the lost Union works, driving away the rebels who occupied the position. Arthur Manigault later lamented that his men had to give up the ground they had fought so bravely to capture, and blamed it on the incompetence of his superiors. The Union soldiers recaptured an artillery battery, and one of them, who had watched a gun crew load double canister, wanted to try an experiment. He loaded 2 artillery shells, not canister, into the barrel of a 20-pound Parrott rifle, and the gun was fired, but it exploded instead of sending the rounds into the retreating enemy. That particular gun had some problems with the band at the back of the gun and had been handled delicately since Kennesaw Mountain, to not put any added stress on the piece, but the Federal soldier who tried the experiment had no way of knowing. Between 5 and 20 minutes after Mercy's men retook a large section of the works, Wood's division advanced on what rebels were left in the trenches. Part of Bushrod Jones's men still remained, but as the Union troops stopped, they formed into one large mass, fired a volley, then proceeded to charge the works. Major General Henry Clayton, seeing his men being attacked by the Union reinforcements, ordered his men to fall back to safety. At the troop hurt house on the battlefield, Federal soldiers found some of their comrades hiding out after being captured by rebels. They hadn't been sent to Atlanta yet and were thrilled to see blue uniforms come through the door. Some of Adams's men found rebels robbing the wounded Union soldiers in the house and quickly took them prisoner. One man had 3 knapsacks on his back, and one Federal officer surmised that his gluttony brought about his capture. The entrenchments south of the railroad still swarmed with Confederates. James Martin's brigade, part of Joseph Lightburn's division, had been sent southward to help push back Hardee's corps, but they were turned back nearly as soon as they got there. One soldier remembered that Logan gave a short speech to the brigade. "Boys, your guns have been captured. McPherson has been killed. Their guns must be retaken. Let your battle cry be, McPherson and revenge." Martin's men approached the field. Part of his brigade had been left behind in the works and had been thrown out by the Confederate attack, specifically the 55th Illinois and 57th Ohio. Those 2 regiments and the 47th Ohio from Wells Jones's brigade were hunkered down, unable to go any further. Martin told his newly arriving regiments to move through their comrades and press on. As they did so, they called for the 55th Illinois and the 57th Ohio to follow them. They did so, but the whole brigade got pinned down again. Martin saw the 47th Ohio approaching and told his men that when they arrived, charge with them. In a deep, solid mass, Martin's brigade slammed into the Confederates of Abda Johnson. The Confederates under Johnston were pushed away. Johnston looked west and could see Randall Gibson's brigade of Louisianians coming east, and he began to formulate how they, together, could retake the position. But to Johnston's dismay, Gibson's men all of a sudden began moving west, away from the fight. Johnston remained on the field, helping as many of his men as possible to get to the rear. John Coltart realized the precarious situation he now found himself in, and pulled back to avoid being overrun by Union attacks. All of the Union works were recaptured. The rebels held that position for only an hour before being driven back. To the north, John Higley's brigade, never quite finding Manigault or Jones's line to extend the flank, ran into the 4th Iowa, who had been dispatched to an old Confederate artillery emplacement from their initial attack to drive back Jones's 2 regiments. Both sides characterized it as a spirited fight, but the Confederates never assaulted the works, just fired volleys at the Iowans, which the Iowans reciprocated. Higley's men fell back, and any threat to the 15th Corps was put to rest, the Union having total control of their works again. As historian Earl Hess explained, the fact that Mercy's brigade could march to the railroad and spearhead the recovery of the lost 15th Corps line highlights both the early breakdown of the Bate-Walker attack at Sugar Creek and the lateness of Cheatham's assault. Even so, the sorry level of command and control exhibited by the Corps, division, and many brigade commanders along the Georgia Railroad contributed greatly to the Federal ability to recover the lost earthworks. Federal commanders managed to exert an appreciably higher level of control over their units to good effect. On the Army and Army Group level, Hood merely gave an order to assault and then took himself out of the picture. In contrast, Sherman watched from the vantage point of Copeland Hill and acted effectively to set in motion heavy artillery fire and a powerful division-level attack to retrieve a temporary setback. The 15th Corps of the Army of the Tennessee pushed Benjamin Cheatham's corps out of the entrenchments that the Confederate corps captured just an hour before. To the south, the attacks by George Maney's division and Patrick Cleburne's division were about to be renewed, at least partially. Francis M. Walker's brigade, which William Hardee sent to his right to aid in the attacks by William Bate and William H. T. Walker's divisions, didn't engage in the earlier attacks and now came back to the left of Hardee's line, back to Maney's division, where it belonged. Additionally, William Barkelow's brigade also came to the left to assist Cleburne and Maney. Barkelow, who took command of the brigade when Hugh Mercer became the division commander when William H. T. Walker was killed, claimed he was told Cleburne no longer needed the brigade. Barkelow excused himself from the field because he had left his sick bed to fight in the battle, but now he was too exhausted to continue. He handed over command of the brigade to Morgan Rawls of the 54th Georgia. This was the third change of commanders for this brigade in that single day of battle. Rawls and Walker advanced and hit the Yankee troops in the flank, pushing them back in great haste, rolling them up again for the second time that day. Walker's brigade slammed into the front of the Union position just south of Bald Hill and made repeated attacks against the position, diverting the attention of the Federals, who continued to get hit in the flank by Rawls. Sam Watkins of the 1st Tennessee Infantry under Walker remembered, "We rushed forward up the steep hillsides, the seething fires from 10,000 muskets and small arms, and 40 pieces of cannon hurled right into our very faces, scorching and burning our clothes and hands and faces from their rapid discharges, and piling the ground with our dead and wounded almost in heaps. It seemed that the hot flames of hell were turned loose in all their fury, while the demons of damnation were laughing in the flames, like seething serpents hissing out their rage. We gave one long and loud cheer and commenced the charge. As we approached their lines, like a mighty inundation of the river Acheron in the infernal regions, Confederate and Federal met. Officers with drawn swords meet officers with drawn swords, and man to man meets man to man with bayonets and loaded guns. The continued roar of battle sounded like unbottled thunder. Blood covered the ground, and the dense smoke filled our eyes and ears and faces. The groans of the wounded and dying rose above the thunder of battle. But being heavily supported by Cleburne's division and by General L. E. Polk's brigade, headed and led by General Cleburne in person, and followed by the 1st and 27th up the blazing crest, the Federal lines waver and break and fly, leaving us in possession of their breastworks and the battlefield, and I do not know how many pieces of artillery, prisoners, and small arms. On the final charge that was made, I was shot in the ankle and heel of my foot. I crawled into their abandoned ditch, which then seemed full and running over with our wounded soldiers. I dodged behind the embankment to get out of the raking fire that was ripping through the bushes and tearing up the ground. The fire enraged in front, we could hear the shout of the charge and the clash of battle. While I was sitting here, a cannonball came tearing down the works, cutting a soldier's head off, spattering his brains all over my face and bosom, and mangling and tearing 4 or 5 others to shreds. As a wounded horse was being led off, a cannonball struck him, and he was literally ripped open, falling in the very place I had just moved from. Walker was mortally wounded in the attack. Rawls was also wounded, but survived. He turned command over to Cincinnatus Gotton of the 57th Georgia. The attack was masterful, and unlike the previous attacks on the flank, had held together instead of breaking apart, but it was now starting to stall. Grenville Dodge, the 16th Corps commander who fought against William Bate and William H. T. Walker's division earlier in the day, had requested for the 17th Corps to link up with his troops since the attack. As the Federal soldiers fell back from this most recent attack, they came close to forming that link as Federal soldiers rallied to return fire against the rebels. By this point, Cleburne's men were back in the front line, extending the Confederate line to the right. Young and Govan's men attacked the Union battle line, and hand-to-hand fighting broke out. 2 of Govan's men approached the color bearer of the 78th Ohio and attempted to grab him and the flag. The color bearer knocked one of the men down with his fist. The Ohioan was shot in the shoulder, and the 2 men began to drag him and the flag toward the Confederate line. Captain John Orr of Company H of the 78th Ohio ran up, began to slash with his sword until the rebels were scared off, and the flag and its bearer could be brought back to the Union line. Darkness was beginning to cover the battlefield. The Confederates of William Hardee's corps remained close to the enemy line, not wanting to give up the ground they captured. As the fight raged on the Union left flank, Confederate cavalry commander Joseph Wheeler was attacking Decatur and the little garrison of troops stationed there. 3 Union regiments guarded 1,600 Union Army wagons loaded with supplies. The whole day, Wheeler pressed the small band of men, but the stubborn Federals performed a slow withdrawal, delaying the rebel host, making sure all the wagons got away. By the time the Federals were north of the town, James Riley's brigade of the 23rd Corps of the Army of the Ohio came to assist them and prevent Wheeler from capturing the wagons. With that action concluded, the Battle of Atlanta came to an end. It was a brutal battle for both sides, with the Union battle line breaking on 3 separate occasions, but each time they were able to take back the lost ground and fight off the rebels. The undulating terrain wreaked havoc in the Confederate attacks by breaking up their formation and weakening the attacks overall. So, even though the rebels were able to break the Yankee line on multiple occasions, they weren't able to follow up on those successes. The Union lost 3,722 men in all, and the Confederacy lost 5,500 men in all, bringing the battle to a total of 9,222. The bloodiest battle of the Atlanta Campaign. Within 3 days, Confederate Army Commander John Bell Hood launched 2 massive attacks against William T. Sherman's army group, but none drove the Federal commander from the field. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, or purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you.